Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an important update on the war in Iran because I think this story has now reached a really critical point. And the reason this matters is not simply because what's happening between the two countries, Iran and the United States. This has potential massive implications for virtually every major economy around the world because although the large-scale exchange of missiles and bombs has largely stopped, the economic consequences of this conflict have most definitely not stopped. The Strait of Hormuz remains heavily disrupted. Global shipping is still very minimal coming through that stretch of water. Oil and gas supplies remain under severe pressure. Emergency inventories are being severely depleted. Transport and insurance costs are now higher globally. And the longer this continues, the greater the risk that all of this feeds through into higher inflation, higher interest rates, and weaker economic growth around the world. So in many ways, we've moved away from the military phase of this crisis into the economic war. And potentially that could be much more damaging over the long term because over the past few weeks, we've repeatedly heard that negotiations are progressing. We've heard Donald Trump saying that a deal was close to being done. We've heard reports that the parameters of an agreement were emerging. There was genuine optimism that the Strait of Hormuz might reopen and that normal trade could gradually resume. But over the past few days, that optimism has evaporated. Iran says there has been absolutely no progress in reviving the interim agreement. The United States is now saying that it can maintain the naval blockade of Iran indefinitely. Washington is preparing another round of economic pressure. Donald Trump is talking about Iran paying reparations. Iran is demanding reparations from America for all of the damage. And the fundamental disagreements over sanctions, frozen Iranian assets, uranium enrichment, and control of the Strait of Hormuz remain completely unresolved. So rather than moving forward towards a peace, there is now a very real possibility that this becomes a prolonged standoff. And that matters to everyone. But before we get into the details on all of that, if you're enjoying these videos, could you please give me a thumbs up? If you have the option and you can see the little symbol alongside the thumbs up, if you could hit that hype button because that will help promote this video with the YouTube algorithm. And if you're not a subscriber, please hit that subscriber button. So let's start with where the negotiations actually stand because the situation has changed quite dramatically. Back in June, the United States and Iran agreed an interim arrangement that was supposed to bring an immediate and permanent end to military operations and provide a window in which the two sides could negotiate a comprehensive agreement. That agreement subsequently fell apart. Donald Trump declared it effectively over in July, and Iran later suspended its participation. Since then, mediators have been attempting to resurrect it, but Iran is now saying there has been absolutely no progress. And that's significant because only a short time ago we were hearing much more optimistic language. Pakistan was suggesting that some sort of deal might be close. Donald Trump repeatedly talked about negotiations moving forward, but those expectations are now being replaced by much harder language on both sides. And probably the biggest change has come from Washington. The United States now says it believes it can maintain the naval blockade of Iran, where it's stopping all of Iran's exports and imports indefinitely. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says America has sufficient naval resources to rotate ships through the region and keep the pressure on Tehran for as long as necessary. At the same time, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that more economic measures are coming. So increasingly, the strategy appears to be moving away from trying to negotiate a rapid conclusion to the conflict and towards something much simpler. Economically squeeze Iran, stop it generating income, restrict its ability to export its oil, cut it off from international finance, increase the cost of trading with the country, and then wait. Washington appears to believe that eventually the economic pressure will become so intense that Tehran will have no choice but to accept America's terms. And the language coming out of Washington is increasingly becoming provocative. The United States is considering additional sanctions against the companies, banks, tankers, and countries that continue dealing with Iran. China is particularly important because before the war, it was buying the overwhelming majority of Iran's seaborne crude exports. If Washington starts imposing much more aggressive secondary sanctions against Chinese companies or even Chinese banks, then suddenly this stops being merely an Iran problem. You potentially introduce another major point of confrontation between the United States and China, because we've obviously got that with regards to what's happening with Russia and its sanctions. And that could have consequences for trade, financial markets, and global supply chains far beyond the Middle East. So this is exactly why what is happening in Iran is so important globally. Every new layer of economic pressure creates another potential economic shock somewhere else. Iran isn't operating in isolation. China needs energy, as does Europe and Asia. Shipping companies need safe routes. Manufacturers need predictable transport costs. Airlines need jet fuel. Consumers need gasoline and petrol and diesel. And central banks need inflation to remain under control. All of those things are being affected by what's happening in and around the Strait of Hormuz. And then we have the reparations issue, which I think makes reaching a permanent settlement much harder. Iran has been demanding compensation for the damage caused during this war. Earlier in the negotiations, Tehran repeatedly sought hundreds of billions of dollars in war compensation. The preliminary June agreement eventually contained proposals for a huge privately funded reconstruction and development program rather than direct American taxpayer funded reparations. But Iran's demand for compensation hasn't disappeared. Tehran also wants sanctions removed and billions of dollars of frozen Iranian assets released. And Donald Trump has now responded by effectively turning that argument on its head. Trump has said that if anyone is going to be paid damages, Iran should be paying the USA. He said the United States intends to seek money from Iran for damage and deaths that Washington attributes to Iran and Iranian-backed groups over the past few decades, so not just as part of this conflict. So we've now got a situation where Iran is saying, you damaged our country, therefore you need to compensate us. And the United States is saying, no, you caused damage across the Middle East and to Americans, therefore you need to compensate us. Now that's not exactly a foundation for a straightforward peace settlement. And this comes on top of the other resolved issues. Iran wants its frozen assets released. It wants its sanctions removed. It wants guarantees about the ability to trade internationally, and it wants recognition of its rights with regards to the Strait of Hormuz. It actually wants to start charging. Certainly it wants to have approval rights over every single ship moving through the water. And critically, Iran continues to insist that it has the right to maintain a civilian nuclear program, and that includes uranium enrichment. The United States and Israel remain vehemently opposed to Iran retaining a pathway that could potentially allow it to develop nuclear weapons. And that remains one of the hardest problems to resolve because this isn't simply about money. You can negotiate sanctions and frozen assets and theoretically negotiate reconstruction funds. But if one side believes it has a sovereign right to enrich uranium and the other side believes that enrichment represents an unacceptable security threat to the world, finding a middle ground becomes incredibly difficult. And while everyone argues about those issues, the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted. That's where the global economic story becomes particularly important, because before this conflict, roughly 20% of global oil and LNG passed through that narrow stretch of water every single day. And we just think about that. 1 barrel in 5 moved through the Strait of Hormuz. That was the exposure that we had. I don't think anybody really appreciated that until now. So when traffic through the strait is dramatically reduced, this isn't a small regional inconvenience for the countries surrounding that water. You're interfering with one of the main arteries of the global economy, and that has consequences elsewhere. European countries now pay more for energy. Asian economies are having to pay more for the imported oil products. Airlines are all paying more for jet fuel. Shipping companies are now paying higher insurance premiums. Manufacturers are seeing their transportation costs increase. Road haulage companies are having to pay more for their fuel. Food distribution is becoming more expensive. And eventually, many of those costs are passed through to you and me, the consumers. That's how a war thousands of miles away from where you live ends up affecting somebody filling up their car, buying groceries in Germany, filling up their vehicle in the United States or China, or running a factory in Japan. And that is exactly why the longer this standoff continues, the more dangerous it becomes economically. There have also been fresh attacks involving international shipping. Ships have continued to face attacks and interdictions in and around the Gulf and the Red Sea. That keeps insurers nervous and makes commercial operators much more reluctant to move vessels through dangerous waterways. And even if the physical supply of oil still exists, it doesn't help enormously if companies can't move that oil reliably and economically from the producers to the countries that need it. Then we get on to the really big issue: global oil supply. The International Energy Agency has now increased its estimate of the decline in global oil supply this year to around 4.3 million barrels per day. That is an enormous number. It represents roughly 4% of total worldwide oil supply, and critically, the forecast has actually deteriorated. So rather than energy markets gradually normalizing as this conflict drags on, the expected supply shortfall is getting larger, and governments have managed to cushion some of the impacts so far by releasing oil from their emergency reserves, their rainy day funds. But emergency reserves are exactly what they suggest. They're for emergencies. They aren't an unlimited alternative source of supply. Once you've released that oil, it's gone until you replenish it. And replenishing those reserves potentially creates another problem, because governments eventually have to go back into the market and buy that oil again to put it back into the reserve. So if this conflict continues for another 6 months, another year, or who knows how long, the question becomes increasingly important. How long can the world continue filling the gap from its rainy day inventories? Because if reserves continue to decline while the underlying supply problems remain unresolved, markets eventually become much more vulnerable to shocks. And that's where this could become really uncomfortable. Imagine we continue drawing down those oil inventories. Then another tanker is attacked, or another refinery is damaged, or another pipeline goes offline, or there's a new escalation between Iran and one of the Gulf states. Suddenly there is much less spare capacity available to absorb a future shock. So prices can therefore move very quickly. We've already seen how sensitive oil prices are to developments in the negotiations. When markets thought a deal was close by, oil fell. When optimism faded, oil prices rose. So the price of energy is effectively reacting to every headline coming out of Washington and Tehran. And that matters enormously for inflation, because oil doesn't simply affect the price of gasoline. Oil affects aviation, shipping, plastics, chemicals, agriculture, food distribution, construction, manufacturing. Virtually every part of the economy either consumes energy directly or depends on something that does. And natural gas is potentially just as important. The Gulf is a major supplier of LNG to world markets. If LNG supplies remain disrupted, or traders believe there is a greater risk of disruption, gas prices can rise as countries compete for alternative cargoes. That can feed directly into electricity prices, as a lot of European countries use gas to produce electricity, industrial costs, and also household bills. So if the war continues to place upward pressure on energy costs, central banks are faced with a very nasty dilemma. Inflation stays higher for longer. That makes it much more difficult to cut interest rates. Higher interest rates then put additional pressure on consumers, companies, and governments. Mortgage costs stay higher. Corporate borrowing remains expensive. Governments pay more interest on their debt. Investment then slows, and economic growth ultimately weakens. So you can see the chain reaction. Iran and America don't reach a deal. Hormuz remains disrupted. Oil and gas remains expensive. Inflation stays higher. Interest rates also remain high. Economic growth therefore slows. And suddenly a geopolitical disagreement in the Middle East is affecting living standards and economic policy all around the world. That's why I think this remains one of the most important economic stories globally. The missiles might not currently be flying backwards and forwards on a scale they were earlier in the conflict, but economically, the war is very much still taking place. In some respects, this stage could prove even more damaging. Physical attacks destroy buildings and infrastructure immediately. Economic disruption can slowly drain hundreds of billions of dollars from economies around the world, and it can continue doing that month after month after month. And that's why the latest comments from the United States about maintaining the blockade indefinitely are so important. Indefinitely is a very long time in financial markets. It's a very long time if you're drawing down emergency oil stacks or when shipping routes aren't operating normally. Well, there's a very long time when central banks are desperately trying to bring inflation under control. The United States appears to believe that time is on its side. It believes Iran's economy will deteriorate faster than the economic consequences will hurt America. Iran appears to believe something very different. Tehran knows the Strait of Hormuz gives it an enormous leverage because disruption there doesn't simply hurt the United States economy, it actually hurts everybody. And that may explain why Iran has been prepared to maintain such a hard negotiating position. Essentially, both sides appear to believe that the other one will eventually suffer enough pain to compromise. And that creates a very dangerous standoff, because what happens if neither side stands down? What happens if Iran doesn't ever capitulate? What happens if the United States says it's never going to lift the blockade? What happens if neither side backs down on uranium enrichment or doesn't want to agree anything with regards to the sanctions? Now we've got both sides arguing about which one should pay reparations. At this point, you no longer have a temporary disagreement holding up a peace agreement. You've got a potentially permanent impasse, and the world economy is paying for it every single day that this continues. So after weeks of hearing that a deal may be close by, I think the situation today looks considerably less encouraging. The military fighting might have reduced, but the economic conflict is intensifying. Washington is promising more pressure. Iran is refusing to surrender its demands. Reparations have become yet another obstacle. The Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted. Global oil supplies remain under pressure. Emergency reserves are declining. And the longer this goes on, the greater the potential impact on inflation, interest rates, and economic growth throughout the world. Peace hopes simply haven't stalled. Right now, they appear to have collapsed. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you did like what I've said, or maybe didn't like it, but you thought it was interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please hit that hype button, which is alongside the thumbs up if you have the option to do so, because it will really help this video. If you haven't subscribed, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much to everyone that's watching these videos and supporting me. If you bought me a coffee, or sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. Really does help to keep me motivating and making these videos. I don't think I would still be doing it if it wasn't for your support. So thank you so much, and I'll see you again next time.